June 6, 1944, 6:31. The English Channel is gray and heaving, and somewhere off the coast of Normandy a landing craft rises on a swell, then slams down hard enough to rattle teeth. Inside, a young sapper grips a rubber-cased explosive charge to his chest as though it might keep him warm. He is not carrying a rifle. His job, in the next few minutes, is not to fight the German army. His job is to walk into the surf, in full view of machine guns sighted to kill him, and clear a 16-metre path through a forest of steel and mines so that the tanks behind him can get ashore. He has perhaps 10 minutes to do it before the sea covers his workspace entirely. This is the story of the men who cleared the beaches of Normandy under fire, and of the extraordinary engineering effort, 3 years in the planning, that made the invasion of Europe possible at all. Without them, the greatest amphibious assault in history would have foundered in the surf, tanks burning uselessly on the tideline while the infantry died in the open. What they achieved in those first chaotic hours has been overshadowed, in popular memory, by the drama of the infantry assault itself. But without the obstacle clearance teams, there would have been no assault to remember. By the spring of 1944, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had transformed the beaches of northern France into one of the most heavily engineered defensive systems ever constructed. He did not believe the invasion could be stopped once it reached the interior of France. The only place to defeat it, he argued, was at the water's edge in the first few hours, while the attacker was at his weakest. Acting on that conviction, Rommel ordered the construction of a belt of obstacles along the tidal zone of the invasion beaches, designed to be submerged at high tide and exposed at low, so that landing craft would either be gutted on them at high water or forced to unload troops far out at low water, under fire, with no cover at all. The obstacles themselves came in several deadly families. Belgian gates, sometimes called Element C, were steel lattice frames over 3 meters tall, originally designed as anti-tank barriers on the Belgian border and repurposed wholesale for the beaches. Hedgehogs were made from 3 lengths of steel rail welded together at angles, capable of tearing open the hull of a landing craft like a tin opener through a ration tin. Log ramps, angled stakes driven into the sand, and rows of simple wooden posts rounded out the barrier, and by the early months of 1944, many of these obstacles had mines lashed to their tips, or artillery shells wired to detonate on contact. Along a 50-mile stretch of coastline, Rommel's engineers and conscripted laborers, working with a speed that alarmed Allied intelligence, had planted hundreds of thousands of these devices. Estimates for the density on some sectors ran to several thousand obstacles per mile of beach, though exact figures remain difficult to establish given the pace of construction right up to the eve of invasion. For the Allied planners of Operation Overlord, this presented a problem that bordered on the impossible. The invasion could only succeed if landing craft could put men and vehicles ashore intact, and it could only succeed if the second and third waves, bringing tanks, artillery, and supplies, could follow without the beaches becoming a graveyard of wrecked craft. Planners had originally hoped to land at high tide, giving landing craft the shortest possible run across open sand, but that would mean landing directly into the belt of underwater obstacles at the point where they were most dangerous and least visible. Landing at low tide exposed the obstacles for clearance but forced the infantry to cross several hundred meters of open beach under fire before reaching any cover at all. There was no configuration of tide and timing that removed the danger. The only answer was to accept a compromise timing and clear the obstacles by hand, under fire, in the opening minutes of the assault, before the tide reclaimed the beach. The solution came from an unlikely marriage of specialized units and specialized machinery, developed in Britain over more than 2 years of trial, failure, and redesign. On the American beaches, the task fell chiefly to naval combat demolition units, teams of naval personnel and Seabees trained specifically in underwater and beach demolition, working alongside U.S. Army engineers. On the British and Canadian beaches, the burden fell to the Royal Engineers, working in close coordination with the armored vehicles of Major General Percy Hobart's 79th Armored Division, universally known to the men who served alongside them with a mixture of affection and awe, as Hobart's funnies. Hobart, a brilliant and famously difficult armored warfare theorist who had been effectively forced out of the British Army earlier in the war, was recalled specifically to solve the problem of getting tanks ashore against fortified beaches. What he and his engineers produced was a family of specialized armored vehicles built on the reliable chassis of the Churchill and Sherman tanks, each modified to perform a single, narrowly defined task that ordinary infantry or engineers could not perform under fire. The Sherman Crab carried a rotating drum fitted with lengths of chain that thrashed the ground ahead of the tank, detonating buried mines in a cleared lane roughly 3 meters wide, at a walking pace that felt, to the crew inside, agonizingly slow while shells burst around them. The Churchill AVRE, standing for Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers, replaced its main gun with a short-barreled spigot mortar nicknamed the Petard, capable of lobing a 40-pound demolition charge, referred to by the crews as the Flying Dustbin, directly into concrete bunkers at close range. Other AVRE variants carried bundles of wood and brushwood called fascines, dropped into ditches and craters to let following vehicles cross, or carried portable bridging sections, or towed rollers designed to explode pressure-fused mines before the tank's own tracks reached them. None of this armor, however, could do anything about the underwater obstacle belt itself, which had to be tackled directly by men in the water. The gapping teams, as they became known, were organized into small units of engineers and demolition specialists, each assigned a specific lane on a specific beach, with orders to clear it to a defined width within a defined time, regardless of what was happening around them. Their equipment was almost primitive by comparison with the armor rolling ashore behind them: packs of plastic explosive, primer cord, waterproofed fuses, and hand tools for lashing charges to obstacle after obstacle, working from the seaward edge of the obstacle belt back towards the beach so that the falling tide would not trap them against a wall of steel they had not yet cleared. A trained team could, in good conditions, clear and detonate a lane through a dense obstacle field in roughly the 10 to 15 minutes the tide allowed them, an operation not unlike disarming an entire minefield while standing in the open, in full view of a defended coastline, with the clock running against you rather than merely the enemy. The reality of June 6th bore only a passing resemblance to the rehearsed plan. On Omaha Beach, American gapping teams landed into a killing ground that the planners had not fully anticipated, facing German defenders in far greater strength than intelligence had suggested, and losing men and equipment to accurate fire before a single charge could be set. Of the 16 gaps ordered to be blown on Omaha in the opening minutes, only a handful were completed on schedule, and the survivors of several demolition teams improvised, working under fire with reduced numbers and damaged equipment to clear what lanes they could. Casualty rates among the demolition teams on Omaha that morning were exceptionally severe, among the highest of any specialist unit committed to the invasion, though precise figures vary between accounts and were compounded by the loss of entire boat teams before they ever reached the obstacle line. On the British and Canadian beaches, the presence of Hobart's funnies made a measurable difference. At Gold Beach and Juno Beach, flail tanks and AVREs moved up with the first infantry waves rather than following behind them, clearing mine lanes and breaching sea walls in places where unsupported infantry would have been pinned on the open sand for hours. Accounts from Royal Engineers who served that morning describe working within meters of German positions that had not yet been suppressed, setting charges on obstacles while machine gun fire raked the sand around them, and continuing the work regardless because the tide, unlike the enemy, could not be negotiated with. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The comparison between the German defensive effort and the Allied clearance effort is instructive, because it reveals two very different philosophies of engineering under pressure. German beach defenses, for all their scale, were built with static defense in mind, obstacles that assumed the enemy would be destroyed while still in the water and never require active clearance at all. There was no equivalent on the German side to Hobart's specialized armor, no vehicle designed from first principles to solve the specific tactical problem of breaching a fortified beach while under direct fire. American planners had experimented with obstacle-clearing tanks of their own, but committed to the amphibious D.D. Sherman, a standard tank fitted with a canvas flotation screen, in far greater numbers than to specialized breaching vehicles, a decision that left American gapping teams comparatively more exposed and more reliant on manual demolition than their British counterparts. The British approach, born out of Hobart's insistence that every beach obstacle represented a specific engineering problem with a specific mechanical solution, proved sufficiently effective that American commanders, having seen the funnies in action, requested them for their own sectors in the weeks following the invasion, and elements of the concept were absorbed into subsequent Allied planning for the remainder of the campaign in Northwest Europe. The material impact of the clearance effort is measurable in the simplest terms. Enough lanes were opened, at enough points along the invasion front, for the follow-up waves of armor, artillery, and supplies to get ashore within the critical first day, denying the German defenders the one thing their entire strategy depended upon, namely stopping the invasion at the water's edge. The psychological impact is harder to quantify but no less real. German after-action reports from the sector opposite Golden Juno beaches noted, with something approaching alarm, the speed with which Allied armor appeared to move inland once ashore, a speed made possible only because the obstacle belt had been breached in the opening hour rather than fought over for days. Where clearance failed or lagged, as on parts of Omaha, the human cost climbed accordingly, a grim illustration of how directly the fate of the wider battle rested on the narrow, unglamorous work of men setting explosive charges on steel obstacles in the surf. The legacy of that morning's engineering effort extended well beyond Normandy itself. The specialized armor pioneered by the 79th Armored Division was refined and expanded for subsequent operations, including the crossing of the Rhine, and influenced post-war thinking on combat engineering doctrine across NATO armies for decades afterwards. Surviving examples of the funnies, including flail tanks and AVREs, can today be seen at the Bovington Tank Museum in Dorset and at several sites along the Normandy coast itself, silent reminders of machinery that once had to work at walking pace under direct fire. Sections of the original obstacle belt, along with wrecked landing craft and abandoned demolition equipment, remain visible at extreme low tide on parts of the Normandy coastline even now, more than 8 decades on, slowly being reclaimed by the same sea that once made them so lethal. It is worth returning, in closing, to that sapper crouched in the landing craft at 0631, charge held against his chest, watching the beach come into focus through the spray. He did not know, in that moment, whether the tide would beat him, whether the machine gun position on the bluff above had been suppressed, or whether the men either side of him would still be standing in 10 minutes' time. What he knew was the job: set the charge, move to the next obstacle, keep moving, because the alternative was a beach choked with burning tanks and a second wave with nowhere to land. Multiply that single moment across dozens of beaches, hundreds of teams, and thousands of obstacles, each one requiring the same steady, unglamorous, lethal work, and you begin to understand what actually opened the door to occupied Europe on June 6, 1944. It was not, in the end, only the courage of the infantry that carried the day, though that courage was real, and it was immense. It was also the quiet, methodical work of men who walked into a minefield with a stopwatch running against them, and the extraordinary machines built specifically to do what no ordinary tank or ordinary soldier could do alone. The beaches of Normandy were not simply stormed. They were, first, painstakingly dismantled, obstacle by obstacle, charge by charge, under fire, by men whose names most of us will never know. That is the story the tanks and the newsreels rarely tell. It is, in many ways, the story that made all the rest of it possible.